Příště bude mluvit Václav Cílek, kterého určitě všichni znáte, a bude možná mluvit z části o svých apokalyptických vizích, ale doufám, že ne za stolik. Mělo by to být o tom, jestli vůbec existuje nebo existovalo takzvané velké zrychlení, to znamená taková ta prudká změna životního stylu a vlastně všeho, co se děje na planetě během 20. století, a o tom, jak rychle probíhají změny v životním prostředí a co o tom vlastně můžeme všechno vědět. Takže všechny zvuk, bude to určitě velmi zajímavé. And now let's switch to English. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Brian Enquist. Many of you already know him because he had already 2 talks here in Biological Thursdays. One was 9 years ago when he spent a sabbatical in our Center for Theoretical Study, and the other was 11 years ago, actually. He's a prominent ecologist and evolutionary biologist, let's say, or something like this, from the University of Arizona, and importantly, he's one of the founder of the metabolic theory of ecology. Metabolic theory of ecology is something we used to teach in several courses, and so he's one of the founder of this huge theory, huge attempt to synthesize different pieces of like ecological knowledge or ecological theory. But today he will speak about something completely new, and it will be about megabiota and its role.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you so much for the invitation and for your hospitality. It's fantastic being back. I've missed being in Prague. So coming back has brought back a lot of very good memories and a lot of things that I can't remember for probably good reasons. So thank you for that. But actually, it's interesting that you pointed out that it has been 11 years since I was last here. And since that time, we had been working on metabolic scaling theory. And what I'm going to actually present today is still effectively metabolic scaling theory. It's the new things that we've been thinking of, new applications then of this work. So to get rolling, I wanted to first highlight 4 people in particular whose hard work lies behind effectively everything that I'm going to be presenting today. So the work, as David indicated, is actually new. So I welcome criticism, I welcome questions at the end, because we're trying to hit these ideas off of new people. So what I wanted to start with is actually one of my favorite pictures. This is actually the first picture taken of the Earth from a human. And this was taken from one of the first Apollo missions when they first looked back on the Earth. And I think it's actually very appropriate because as a science of ecology is relatively young, for the first time, we're now starting to take what we're learning and try to apply it at the scale of the entire Earth, right? So what I'm going to be doing today is trying to scale up to the biosphere. I want to say something about the functioning, and in particular, the metabolism of the biosphere. But we're going to start a little bit more humble level at first. In particular, maybe some landscapes or communities that are more tangible, right? And so this entire talk is about this overall search that I and a lot of colleagues have been trying to partake in, and that is trying then to build and add to ecological science in a way where we can actually make some predictions. Predictions that we can go out and test. Predictions based on theory that we can disprove, or we can show where it's wrong and improve then that theory in this iterative cycle. And so the overall question that I'm interested in asking is, can we scale from measurements of individuals all the way up to, say, communities, but also ultimately up to ecosystems, and then maybe the entire biosphere? So what underlies this is an attempt to try to develop analytical theory to begin to try to make then these connections. So the main kind of foundation that I want to hopefully impress on you is that when we step back and we think about biological diversity, that probably the first axis that you would use to describe biological diversity is that of body size. So if we were going to step back and characterize biological diversity, we could first characterize everything that we see in the world in terms of how big they are, right? Ranging from small things then to large things. So again, this is a conspicuous measure of life, all this size differences. Okay? So a general aspect of life is size. And throughout the evolution then of life on Earth has really been characterized by the evolution of body size. And so over and over again, repeatedly in different clades, we see the evolution of increasingly larger and larger organisms, starting from very small, humble beginnings, and keeping those small, humble beginnings, but then adding on increasing complexity, increasingly large sizes. So, why is larger better? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and I don't want to really delve into why bigger things are better, but bigger things can overcome certain physical forces like viscosity, right? Bigger things are also metabolically, in certain environments, more powerful, and they can control and they can dominate more resources, okay, over smaller things. Bigger things can also do more tasks, more processes, they contain more information. But also, if you're bigger, you tend to live longer, right? So you can specialize in other resources, and you can live in new locations. So there's multiple reasons why we would expect selection then to evolve larger things. And it's probably not by coincidence then that the biggest things that have ever lived on Earth are alive right now. So you may think that perhaps it's the blue whale, right? But actually, the blue whale is not the largest single organism. It's actually the General Sherman tree, an order of magnitude larger than the blue whale. So for a single individual, this is the largest individual on the planet. So when I started working with my collaborators, we realized that we needed a term to describe these big things, right? And so we call these big things the megabiota. It's the largest animals, it's the largest plants, right? It's the largest organisms then on the planet. And so we can step back and we can think about other big things and why other big things are important. So today's societies are actually the largest ever, right? So the largest city on Earth, okay, is currently Tokyo with a population of almost getting close to 40 million. The biggest corporation is actually alive and well today. This is the Sinopac Group. It's currently worth $486 US in billions per year. Pretty massive corporation. So the largest cities and these largest corporations disproportionately have a large impact on the global economy, right? So I don't think anyone would dispute the importance then of these very large human inventions, societies and economies in terms of the impact on the world. And we can just look back to 2009, actually one of the last times I was here, to then point then to the Great Recession, which was mainly caused by the failure of the largest banks in the world, right? And so the failure of a few large banks led to a huge catastrophe that still we're trying to recover from. So we are currently facing a similar problem of a magnitude that I don't think we've even started to fathom. And that is the loss of the largest organisms on Earth. And so what I would like to do in this talk is ask the question, how do the largest plants and animals influence the functioning of ecosystems and the biosphere? So, like our largest cities, like our largest banks, largest societies, the megabiota dominates the flow of resources in the ecosystem. They dominate the storage of carbon and nutrients, okay, our biological wealth and capital. They are also the central nodes in networks of interactions. All right, so if we think about the exchange of biological information, biological wealth, it's the largest things that have the disproportionate impact. But in terms of priorities for conservation, that is where we should be putting our time, effort, and treasure, it's probably the largest things that will have the disproportionate impact. So what I would like to do today is really emphasize kind of 4 points. I would like to talk about what we call the downsizing of the biosphere and the need for theory then to really quantify the magnitude of the effects of the loss of the megabiota. I'm going to give you a very short primer on the importance of body size or allometry. Some of you, this is going to be review. Going to introduce then the beginnings, and I want to emphasize the beginnings, of more of a general theory for the megabiota. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the role of the megabiota in the functioning of the biosphere. Okay, downsizing of the biosphere. So, in general, there are 3 central drivers to changes in the biosphere. The first is the increasing human domination of the biosphere in terms of appropriation of land, taking of the productivity of the earth, resources, nutrients, and so on. The second, obviously, is climate change, right? So species and ecosystems are changing. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about any of these, but instead what I want to talk about is the other major impact on the biosphere that I think has not received the attention that it should. And that is the downsizing of the biosphere via the loss of the megabiota. And perhaps this has the most long-lasting effect on this new era that we're calling the Anthropocene, but also on the functioning and the metabolism of the biosphere. It's the loss of the largest plants and animals. So one of the primary signatures of the Anthropocene has been the progressive reduction and elimination of the largest organisms. And if you start delving into the literature of our various different estimates, I have been struck by not only how I think ignorant we as ecologists have been of the magnitude of this impact, but also of how little we really know of the ongoing impact. So human activities across the globe have primarily and disproportionately hunted and exploited the largest animals and plants. And we can think of enormous numbers of stories back in the historical record of the exploitation of large animals and plants. And the loss of the largest animals and plants actually started quite some time ago. Right? So if we go back then to the Pleistocene, so I'm taking here some recent analyses from Felisa Smith et al., where we're then looking at the mean body size of animals then across the major continents as well as the oceans, kind of historically going back to 100,000 years, 15,000 years, and 50 years. And in general, across all the continents, there's been a progressive reduction in the mean body size. Within the oceans, that doesn't necessarily appear to be the case, but within the modern period, that is definitely the case. So in terms of the loss of the largest animals, we can begin to map out and we can begin to quantify where not only the surviving large mammals are, but also we can plot out how they're doing. So we're plotting out here the number of declining then megafauna. So effectively across the globe, the largest animals are all in decline. Now, there are some bright spots. David and I were just talking about here within Europe with rewilding. There's certainly some bright spots out there, but I think across the globe, if you compile the numbers, the largest animals are still on decline. In fact, if we look at the 10 most charismatic animals, largest animals, they're all declining. Even if we separate the different populations, then different subspecies, say, of either giraffes or elephants, across the board, relatively recently within our lifespan, they're all decreasing in abundance. If we go to the World Wildlife Fund, their Living Planet report in 2016, one of their main take-home conclusions after crunching through all the data is between 1970 and 2010, when they look at the populations of all mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibian, and fish, their numbers have dropped during that time by 52%. So during our lifespan, we've lost 52% of all animals then on Earth within at least these groups. That's a huge number. Well, what about the largest plants? There was a really intriguing paper published in Nature in 2015 by Crowther et al., where they actually went through, used several different methods to actually estimate and calculate not only the distribution of the world's forests, but actually count how many trees there are on the planet, and historically what has happened then to all of those trees through time. So here's the resulting map showing in the green areas the distribution of forests. And they actually went through the fun calculation of coming up with, there's actually about 3 trillion trees on the planet, okay, plus or minus a certain amount, right? Which is awesome, right? I've always wanted to count the total number of trees on Earth, but this is our best estimate so far. And it took until 2015 to actually come up with a reasonable number. But if you delve then within this paper, what they actually estimate is that based on observed rates of deforestation from satellites, every year 15 billion trees are cut down. Every year, 15 billion. And they estimate since the start of human civilization that globally the total number of trees on the planet has decreased by 46%, which is remarkably similar to the loss in abundance of animals since 1970. But if you actually delve into these numbers, what you actually find is that the loss of trees is highly non-random. The trees then that are being lost disproportionately are the largest and the oldest trees. They're becoming more rare and threatened. And across the board, big and old trees are declining in all forests at all latitudes. From all of our best data sets and attempts then to measure this, we see dramatic decreases in the biggest trees. So we're taking what was once continuous, old-growth forest, chopping it up into pieces. And all of our best ecological experiments, one of the primary signals then that comes out of human land use is that one of the first things then to change is the microclimate associated then with forests, which then leads to the disproportionate loss then of all the biggest trees surrounding then these cut fragments. So whenever we go to any sort of these logged areas, we find that in general, over time, we find that approximately half of the large trees in the surrounding remaining forests tend to decrease in abundance, leaving just the smaller ones. So we have to start thinking of what is the implications of this disproportionate loss of the biggest organisms on Earth. When you're big, you have a disproportionate impact, and I'm going to be going into some of those impacts. But perhaps the one that we have kind of the least amount of knowledge on is how when you take out these big things from the web of ecological interactions, what is that ramifying effect? And this, we literally don't have much of an idea. I would point you to some of these earlier papers, in particular this paper in Science by Jim Estes et al., who then begin to ask, well, what happens when you start then to take out these big things, and what are the ramifications across ecosystems and biodiversity in general? And we literally have very little idea about how, if we take out the biggest trees, how then that ramifies across then the web of life. So the loss of the megabiota is ramifying to influence numerous other species and trophic interactions that literally we are just beginning to not only describe, but also understand. So there's an urgent need to understand how ecosystems change with the decline of the megabiota. And in ever larger regions of the world, okay, except for maybe some bright spots, will soon lack many of the vital ecological services that large organisms actually provide. And in general, we lack a predictive framework. Right? So can we as ecologists actually go out in the world and say, all right, if you take out this many large animals or this many trees, what is going to happen to our various ecosystem services, but other aspects of biological diversity? And given the scale of the problem, because this is global, it's really unclear if our current ecological theory is really up to the task to begin to predict and forecast the magnitude and the extent on this perturbation at the scale of the biosphere. Okay. So a brief primer on the importance of body size, in particular allometry. So allometry is the study of how changes in size influence biology, broadly defined. So the word allometry was actually introduced by Julian Huxley in 1932, and it refers to the study of the change in the proportion of various parts of an organism, or we can think more broadly, the change in proportion of various measures of biology as a consequence of growth, but ultimately size. And according to Huxley, actually I took his original printed equation here right out of his publication, whereas we have some biological measure of interest, and that's then going to be equal then to a constant, okay, that actually can in principle vary. But then x here is organism size, some measure of size, and this additional exponent value here. Okay. So in the case of the megabiota, what we're going to be doing in this very simplistic equation is basically reducing organismal size and then asking what happens to some biological measure then of interest. So probably one of the more famous but also contentious and intriguing relationship is the relationship between body size and a measure of either metabolism, or in this case I'm going to show you then some data for growth rates of organisms. And so what we can do, because allometry is often comparative between individuals, or in this case comparative between species, we can then begin to compare rates of, again in this case, biomass production. Right? Effectively, how fast organisms are growing. So we can throw some data on insects up there. We can throw some birds on the graph. Gosh, for fun, we can put some fish. Gosh, we have some plant data. Put some mammals on there, some zooplankton. And for fun, we've even done this. We put our best estimates of growth rates of dinosaurs, okay? Things that are long since extinct. What's remarkable is that we can characterize this functional relationship as an approximate power function. And the slope of this relationship tends to cluster around specific values of 3 over 4, or 3/4, or 0.75. And actually for this talk, the actual values of these exponents don't necessarily matter so much, so I don't want to focus on that. But instead, I want to focus on this overall functional relationship and the fact that in general, allometry can be applied with very similar allometric functions across broad groups of organisms. So for larger organisms, the take-home message here is that they require more resources. Right? They produce more biomass, but also they flux more energy and they're more powerful. It's the biggest things that are producing the most biomass, that are fluxing the most nitrogen, water, and carbon than the smaller ones. Here's another allometric relationship. This is earlier work by John Damuth. This is looking at the relationship between mammalian body size, going from small mammals to big mammals, and we're plotting in general their average population density locally, so the number of individuals per unit area. And in general, what we find is that there's a negative relationship, right? Which shouldn't be surprising because big things tend to be locally rare. Right? Smaller things tend to be locally abundant. What about the use of space? Bigger things actually require more home range, larger sizes, canopy sizes, rooting volumes are larger. The distances over which animals then have to travel, or organisms in general have to transport over, also increase with size. So bigger organisms require more space, more territory, and they travel and transport across larger distances. Okay? So there's a space implication then for bigger things. What about fertility? So this is a fun graph, and so this is the fertility rate then of all mammals, but we can also put primates and humans and non-human apes on here just for fun. Right? But the point that I would like to emphasize is that larger organisms have a lower rate of fertility. And that's very important in times of rapid directional change, such as climate change, but also in times of dramatic habitat alteration. So in general, larger things take longer to recover from disturbance because of their fertility rate. Okay, so that was a quick kind of overview of big things and the implications of big things for ecology. Now, can we take some of those bits of knowledge and begin then to put that together to have a more general understanding for the importance then of the megabiota in the biosphere? So the first thing that actually comes out of this work, okay, is that in times of rapid habitat loss, so we're talking about non-equilibrial conditions, but a time of dramatic change, a change that's faster than the time scale of the organism life histories. So in these times of rapid habitat loss and climate change, that is directional changes than in the climate, the megabiota are more prone to extinction. And how then do we know that's true? Well, you can show analytically that mortality and extinction risk to human impact, land use, and climate change is effectively due to three functions, right? Three processes. So the risk of stochastic extinction is due to the mortality risk in extreme events, which scales positively with body size. The per capita fecundity rate, and the size actually of your home range or your geographic range size, how much space you need in order then to have viable population sizes. Those then combine to then give us an expectation for extinction risk. And it turns out that if we put in observed values of the exponents b, c, and d, it turns out that this is a positive allometry. That is, in times of rapid change in habitat loss, extinction rates should scale positively with body size. So larger body size animals and plants are more susceptible. So I'll show you just two examples from recent papers that have been coming out. And we've tried to document all known cases, but these are two pretty clear cases. So here's a case then for mammals within North America and also in Western Eurasia, going back millions of years. And on then this graph, you can see in each one of them, there are two different curves. There's a blue curve and then there is an orange curve. The blue curve represents the largest organisms, or here the megafauna. And here we're also then looking at the smallest organisms. Same thing, North America and Eurasia. I've also, on these graphs, the shaded areas, okay, which are then going to be corresponding to when these two curves start diverging from each other. And again, we're plotting the cumulative numbers of extinctions over time. So remember, because this is millions of years ago, this is effectively before large impacts then of humans, obviously, until recent times. We also then have these dotted kind of areas here. These then are times of high biome heterogeneity. That is when biomes started to break up for various reasons. But we also have times of rapid climate change having to do with aridifications in these areas. So it's during these times of habitat loss and directional climate change where we have this divergence in terms of the cumulative number of extinctions. So it's during these periods of times, the largest animals are disproportionately succumbing then to extinction. I'll take another example for plants. Large plants, it turns out, are very susceptible to increases in temperature and also drought. Plant height is very closely matched to water availability of the environment. That's determined by both precipitation and temperature. What I'm showing you here is the relationship between tree size and tree mortality rate in several different studies. Each of these different lines represents a different study where they went out after a big, hot, dry drought and asked which trees then are dying. Here's the baseline expectation for mortality if there's no temperature, high temperature, and no drought. But during times of increased temperature and increased drought, mortality rates all increase with tree size. In short, when times are stressful, in times of climate change, it's the biggest trees that are dying. So the second kind of main kind of finding is that large animals and plants disproportionately control the size of ecosystem fluxes and pools. So like our analogy with the big banks and the big corporations, when we think about the metabolic capital, the metabolic wealth of ecosystems, most of that wealth is actually stored then within the largest organisms. So can we take this and actually apply it? And so the first kind of aspect of what we kind of focus on and what the theory tells us is that we need to know something about the distribution of sizes in any given location on the planet. Right? And so we call these size distributions. And to characterize what I mean by size distributions, so here's a cartoon of a forest. And if we look at this forest, what you actually find is that there's a lot of small individuals and very few big ones. Right? So the big things are rare, small things are common. So in general, we can characterize a size distribution approximately as a plot, a frequency distribution of the body mass of an individual versus the number of individuals per unit area. So in general, any part of the planet has a curve kind of similar to this. There's some differences, of course, but in general, we find something similar to this. So downsizing of ecological communities, downsizing of ecosystems has the effect of pushing back this curve. So we get this general reduction of the largest individuals and a reduction then of their abundances. Continued size reduction leads to a reduction then in that curve. And to make this as simple as possible, this is what we're modeling. Okay? Changes in the size distributions based on what we know happens in times of climate change and in times of resource extractions that proportionally takes out the largest individuals. So how is the reduction of the largest size animals and plants influence the flux of energy and resources of the biosphere? Well, in general, we can simplify this problem by saying that the total metabolism of a group of organisms, say within a community, is a function of two separate functions than themselves. So we have the allometric scaling of metabolism. So the scaling of metabolism depends on body size. But also we want to know about the distribution of body sizes. So I told you previously that the total amount of metabolism, total amount of resource then used by an organism is dependent on its size. So we need to know that function. But also we need to know the distribution of sizes within a given location, or the size distribution. Well, we can put in what we know from the rest of allometry, and out pops out a series of very interesting predictions. In particular, this term here, R max, this is, we first parameterize then this for trees. So this is the radius of the largest tree in the forest. And it turns out that we can approximate the total metabolism as a linear function of the radius of the biggest tree. So what this predicts is that if you double the size of the largest tree in a forest, given the size distribution, you're going to double the productivity. So the biggest things control the flux of energy and nutrients through ecosystems. They're going to be storing more carbon and nutrients, but also they're going to be the dispersers and fertilizers of the planet as well, as I'm going to show you in a minute. So the total flux within a given trophic level is influenced then by the size distribution and metabolism, but that is ultimately governed in magnitude by the size of the largest individual. So in terms of scaling up the total autotrophic flux and the standing stock biomass, the whole forest metabolism then is going to be a function of the size, dependency of metabolism, and the size distribution. So I'm not going to have time to delve into the details, but one can go through the math, and we can put in our simplified version of these expectations for the functions that underlie each of these. And we can do some simple algebra to come out with predictions for how the whole forest metabolism should depend on the total biomass of plants present. We can also do this for animals, the size distribution of animals and the scaling of metabolism for animals, to get actually a similar but slightly different set of predictions. So this is interesting because it actually says that there's an ecosystem allometry. instead of looking at the size of an individual, we're now looking at the total biomass that's present in a given location. So what this says is that if we double the total biomass of a forest, the whole forest metabolism will actually not double itself, but instead will be raised to the 3/5 power. It's an interesting prediction. And actually nobody has made this prediction before, but we can now go out to look to see if indeed this is true. And just in case, that turns out to be about 0.6. So are ecosystems characterized by allometric scaling relationships? So we didn't know it at the time, but we actually compiled data for this a while back. What I'm showing you here, each data point is a different forest across the globe, where we tried to keep the methodology of sampling all the same. And we can then estimate to pretty good measures the total forest biomass per unit area. And so as the size of the largest tree in that forest increases, the total forest biomass actually increases, but it increases according then to a scaling exponent. It actually turns out that within this data set, that's indistinguishable then from our prediction for how the total standing stock of either carbon or even nutrients, or in this case, total biomass, should then scale with the size then of the largest tree. So the size of the largest tree is important because we know empirically that by far the variable that has the highest impact in terms of influencing net primary productivity then of forest is not so much climate, such as temperature and precipitation, that does have an effect, or even the age of the forest, but instead there's a disproportionate impact on how much biomass there is in terms of influencing how much productivity there is in the forest. So what about animals? So if we take that same kind of framework and parameterize it in terms of animals, what we actually find is that, like forests, the largest animals and plants together control the ecosystem fluxes and pools. So this is intriguing because one of my first introductions actually to macroecology was reading then this paper by Brian Maurer and Jim Brown in 1989, where they actually tried to estimate at the time, and for its time this was a heroic attempt, where they actually plotted the adult body mass of a bird and the continental scale, this is for North America, of the total metabolism then of all of those different bird species. So each data point here is a different bird species across North America. And they estimated the total metabolism. And what they actually found, and it was kind of intriguing and somewhat surprising at the time, that actually the largest birds dominated the total metabolism, of bird metabolism, at the continental scale. And so we're overlaying then here our expected then prediction, okay, in terms of what we actually expect the relationship should be based on the theory that I showed previously. So the disproportionate impact then of the megabiota on ecosystem pools and fluxes can be summarized in this cartoon. So with size downgrading of the megabiota, we're getting this reduction of the size distribution. And because of which, if we looked at the size of the largest plant or animal in your community or in your landscape or in your ecosystem, and if we had a measure of the ecosystem stock, that is, how much total nitrogen or how much total carbon or how much total biomass, or a measure of fluxes such as productivity or even measures of nutrient fluxes or fertility, what we would find is that there's going to be a scaling relationship. But as we start then reducing the largest individuals, these stocks and fluxes are all going to be diminished and reduced. So this is the cartoon version coming out of the analytical predictions. And so then the question is this actually the case? So with the size downgrading then of the biosphere, that would literally implicate a dramatic, potentially severe change in ecosystem stocks and productivity. So the third point that I would like to emphasize that comes out of this work is that the largest organisms disproportionately homogenize nutrient cycling and the fertilization of the planet. And initially this work came from, and this is how this collaboration started, me reading this paper by Chris Dowdy, Adam Wolf, and Yadvinder Maui, where they published this paper in 2013 in Nature Geoscience. And they explored the implications of the reduction or the loss of the Pleistocene megafauna for the fertility of the Amazon. So the Amazon obviously is this huge region, okay, one of the last major areas of rainforest on the planet, but it's currently lacking megabiota. And so they asked, with the extinction of the megafauna, how has that influenced the potential fertility of the Amazon? And so here they talk about these extinct mammals, okay, and they look at the number of species versus body size, and they're able then to kind of extract out body size estimates for these large organisms. And they put together a theory based on some simplistic assumptions about animal movement, animals moving across the Amazon. And they modeled the horizontal flux of nutrients as a diffusion-like process. And so he literally simulated in MATLAB a bunch of animals running around the Amazon, and some of the big ones, because they had big geographic ranges, were able then to forage on plants growing on the nutrient-rich Andes, but then also move down into the lowlands. And in the process, because their gut retention times are much slower, and their home range size and their geographic ranges are slower, the implication is that these big things, these big herbivores, are moving nutrients from one far location to another far location. So that nutrients then are effectively starting to become more homogeneous in terms of the distribution across the landscape. And they modeled this diffusion process, or this diffusivity then of nutrients, as a function of the metabolic rate of an organism, how much plant biomass is present, the home range, or the day range as they call it, that is how wide of an area an organism then is traveling over, the gut passage time, that is how long does it take for a given amount of food then to pass through the intestines and the digestive tract of an animal and be defecated out on the other end. And they summarize this as a simple scaling function of animal body mass. And this exponent is actually pretty close to 1. It's a little bit bigger than 1, obviously. But in general, the diffusivity, the ability then of animals then to move nutrients, disperse nutrients across the landscape, should scale positively then with the size of the largest organism. And so what they asked was that if you then start simulating then landscapes where your maximum body size range is then reduced, what then happens to the fertility of the Amazon? So we took that original model from that original paper and we did some additional simulations where now we put in our predicted scaling relationships as well as the empirical observation scaling relationships. And we asked, as you reduce the size of the largest animal, what is the proportion of soil phosphorus remaining from the original baseline map? So here we're focused then on this region that includes Peru, Bolivia, good chunks of Brazil, okay, and some other than South African countries. And so we can take our baseline expectation for phosphorus concentration. And obviously this is the Amazon River, okay, depositing then a lot of nutrients then out, high concentrations then near the Andes. And we can then simulate the diffusion then of nutrients of these animals then that are ranging in different home range sizes, but then we can start to kill them or cull them in the simulation, and then ask, when we look then at the equilibrial phosphorus concentration, what is the percent remaining? And the story is always the same, no matter how we tweak then this model, is that we always get a reduction in the total amount of soil phosphorus. In essence, big things are helping to disperse nutrients from high concentrations to low concentrations, leading to a more homogeneous distribution then of nutrients. So the immediate implication of this is that loss of the largest animals, herbivores in this case, leads ultimately to a reduction in the fertility of the Amazon. So what about the role of the megabiota in terms of the functioning of the biosphere? Okay, so can we start to make some approximations? And so what I'm going to tell you is very much an approximation. Okay, this is something that we're struggling with, and it needs a lot of additional insight and work, but we felt that it was important to try. So in 2013, there was a paper published by Drew Purvis et al., where they had the provocative title that now is the time to model all life on Earth. Right? Effectively, Drew at the time, he was working for the Microsoft group in the UK, and they wanted to build a huge simulation model where literally they could put in every single individual on Earth and simulate then their behavior and simulate then the implications then for the biosphere. So this model at the time is known as the Mattingly model. We also call it a general ecosystem model, or a GEM, in that what's nice about this approach is that they tried to boil down all of the complexities of biology into just a few parameters that at the time was thought to be the dominant controls over the behavior and the dynamics and the metabolism of the biosphere. But in particular, the Mattingly model starts with allometric relationships, and it emphasizes the importance of size. So the most critical trait or attribute then of a species is its size. And because of which, we're using the Mattingly model to assess the role of body size, in particular the reduction of body size at the scale of the biosphere. And so the output then from the Mattingly model is, here in this case, we're looking at actually the biomass density of all organisms simulated then in the world's oceans, okay, running it through multiple years. And the Mattingly model simulates effectively a trophic web. Okay? Not as detailed as this one, but we have herbivores, we have autotrophs, we have carnivores, we have secondary carnivores, and we have their interactions. And all of these interactions are mediated by their size. So the output of the Mattingly model is a pixel then that's simulated. And within that pixel, we're then simulating then the behavior of each species which has a characteristic body mass, but because of ecological interactions and because of metabolic requirements, that then influences their resulting abundances. So we can then look at variation in abundances then of organisms. But if we then delve into details of who is kind of represented, we have herbivores and carnivores and omnivores, but we have a trophic structure then as well. It's kind of the simplest then approach to a trophic structure. But then what comes out is a distribution of sizes, the size distribution. Now what goes into the model are functions for reproduction, functions for eating, functions for metabolism, functions for mortality, and functions for dispersal. And we start with allometry, those allometric relationships that I showed you earlier. And then we just simulate the effects of changing size. So what I'm going to show you are three simulations. I'm going to show you simulations of a Pleistocene world. Apologies, the PowerPoint got kind of weird. It's a new font. I got a new font when I transferred to this computer. I'm going to show you simulations of a Pleistocene world where the maximum body size is 10,000 kilograms. And I should say that we're only simulating here mammals. Okay? We're trying then to also put plants in this. We get a coupled plant animal then simulation. But we're going to start with the Pleistocene world. And next we're going to change then to the modern world, where, to make it easy, we have 1,000 kilogram is our maximum size. But then we're going to simulate basically the Holocaust, that is a future world, where we've now lost kind of all then mammals down to a size of 100 kilograms. So a dramatic reduction. And we're going to ask what then happens then to our different measures of biosphere metabolism. Okay, so these are a little complicated, so I'm going to work through this. So what I'm showing you here are 3 different maps and 3 different outputs. Okay? Each of these different outputs is our measure of the total biosphere biomass of heterotrophs, a measure of the total biosphere metabolism, and a measure of the biosphere nutrient diffusion. That is, how easily are nutrients diffusing then across then the globe. Now, we're also running through 3 different simulations. This is our baseline no loss of the megafauna. So this is kind of Pleistocene extinctions. Right? And here's the loss of the Pleistocene megafauna. And then, so this is the modern world, but if current then rates then are continued, this is the modern loss of the remaining megafauna. And these maps then are showing then the changes in each one of these biospheric measures. So blue or purple indicates a reduction, and orange or reddish color indicates an increase. So as you can see, as we go from the baseline no loss of the megafauna to the modern world, all you see across the globe is reduction of all of these major measures of biospheric metabolism. Some areas in the world experience more losses than others, but across then the globe we see nothing but reductions. Here, what I'm showing in these 3 graphs is the relationship between body size and nutrient diffusivity, metabolism, and the total biomass then of the biosphere. Each of these different colors corresponds to each of these different worlds. So in our baseline world, what we actually find is that the heterotrophic biomass, as predicted by the analytical theory, by far most of the biomass in the biosphere is contained within the largest animals. But as we reduce then the size of the largest individuals, we then see a dramatic reduction in the total biosphere biomass. The same is the case for the living biosphere metabolism. Most of the biosphere metabolism then is dominated by the largest then individuals. As we then lose them, we see then a reduction. Nutrient diffusion then as well. The other interesting aspect that the Mattingly model then can simulate is what then happens to the smallest individuals if you take out the biggest ones. That is, within the frameworks of the Mattingly model, do the small things compensate? That is, do the small things go crazy? Do they increase in abundance and take up all of that metabolism and nutrients that are now not being used by the biggest individuals? And to our first approximation, while we see some changes in the smallest individuals, it really is very minor, so that the smallest organisms are not compensating on the ecosystem scale for the loss of the biggest ones. So for each of these different measures, under our different scenarios, the baseline loss, okay, the loss of the Pleistocene megafauna, and the modern loss of the megabiota, we see this gradual reduction in each then of these different measures. So to get to the main point, across the board we see reductions in biosphere biomass, metabolism, and the fertilization capacity. Now to quantify the relative magnitude of this, I don't like showing tables, but I tried to simplify this table. So we're looking at each of our biosphere metabolic measures, the biomass, metabolism, and nutrient diffusivity. If you're focused on one column, it would be this one. This is the total percent change from the Pleistocene to the worst case scenario of losing all of the big animals. We see a 44% reduction in biosphere biomass, an 18% reduction in heterotrophic metabolism, and a 92% reduction in global nutrient diffusivity. The magnitude of these changes are huge. Right? This is the metabolism of the biosphere associated with the observed and current rates of loss of just the biggest animals. We're not even including the plants and the interaction then with plants on this yet. So these are sobering results. Now, are these results potentially incorrect? Sure. It's a simulation model, and we tried to make it simple, right? But to our knowledge, this is our first approximation of the magnitude of the impact of the observed loss of just the big animals. So, at the start, I emphasized 3 central drivers to changes in the biosphere. Human domination of the biosphere, climate change, but what I wanted to focus on today was the downsizing of the biosphere because of the loss of the megabiota. And I think this is actually going to be the most long-lasting effect, okay, of the Anthropocene. In particular, because the largest animals and plants are really defining, in many ways, the metabolism of the biosphere. So I started with the question, how do the largest plants and animals influence the functioning of ecosystems in the biosphere? And I showed you several attempts of us trying to quantify, at least to a first approximation, the answers then to this question. And so in general, the largest plants and animals disproportionately impact the biosphere biomass, productivity, and fertility. So there's a lot of bad news in this, right? So it's easy to kind of like come away and be like, oh gosh, geez, that's great, Brian. Thanks for telling me all of this. And these drivers of change in the Anthropocene are rapid, they're dramatic, and it's scary. And it's potentially catastrophic in terms of the impact on the biosphere, and it's very difficult to reverse. But there's actually quite a bit of good news, I think, in all of this. And that is, we do have time, but now, as ecologists, we can begin to forecast changes at the biosphere level. Not just talking about forecasting climate, but we can now start to forecast how the biosphere then is going to respond. We have the tools, we have the rudiments of theory, so that's really good news. Okay, we can address these questions. And we can communicate and visualize these changes in a way that's understandable to the public and stakeholders. And that's also really good news. We can put numbers on our expectations. And so we can link atmospheric sciences with biology, and we can show these relatively simple kind of graphs and communicate their uncertainties then to the public. And despite the enormous complexities, we can simplify the problem. There are places to start, okay? Now, is it perfect? No. But now we can have the debate about how to improve this and move on. But what I think is actually quite important is that conservation efforts now can be streamlined by focusing and promoting the largest animals and trees if the goal is to promote ecosystem functioning and the functioning of the biosphere. There's less guesswork and more focus on the efficient use than of limited funding. So, a theoretical basis for conservation, I would not say that this is a theoretical basis for conservation, but there is a few sets of messages that comes out. And that in particular, currently conservation efforts have been based on this natural charisma of big things, right? So, in terms of donations, right, we try then to sell the loss of the polar bears, the loss of the elephants. And in the literature, these charismatic large animals are often cited as the best justification to protect habitat and other species and entire ecosystems. But I can tell you in general, we don't have theory for this. And now I think we have the rudiments then of a theory to not only justify, but also then to target and hone some of these questions. Now, in the literature, there's considerable debate in terms of, are the conservation goals best achieved by promoting the management of these charismatic species, focusing on whole ecosystem functioning. And so if I were to pull a quote actually from Dan Simberloff, who's basically argued that whether many other species will really fall under the umbrella of these big charismatic species is really a matter of faith in conservation biology, rather than research. I think this work can begin then to kind of help address the concerns here by Simberloff. because we do have a theoretical basis for conservation priority based on management of the megabiota. Promoting the establishment, the promotion and well-being of big animals and plants will have a disproportionate impact. So, what are some of the next steps? Well, it's kind of a laundry list. We still don't know to what extent the smaller organisms can potentially compensate for the loss of the megabiota. We have some indications, but that's still unclear. It's still unclear how the dynamics of ecosystems and biodiversity, all these ecological interactions, how then they change, will be impacted from the loss of the biggest things. How will ecological systems and human interactions become buffered, less buffered, I should say, with the loss of large species? So in terms of the dynamics, the temporal dynamics of ecological systems, we've only started to scratch the surface in terms of the role of big organisms, in terms of buffering ecological interactions and buffering ecological change. Disease dynamics. There's a very interesting literature now about the role of very large organisms in helping them to modulate and buffer emerging diseases and the spread of diseases. A lot of this is contentious, but one thing is clear, is that the big organisms, in particular big animals, impact disease cycles and rates of pathogenesis. How do differences in the patchiness and total area protected interact with differences in body size ranges? So how do established means of conservation, existing areas of protection, how does that then also interact with differences in the sizes then of organisms? I think more importantly, currently we're seeing a renewed interest in ecology in terms of rewilding, reintroducing the big things, promoting the big things. But we don't necessarily know how long it will take in order to restore and revive ecosystem processes. So with that, I want to thank a lot of people, and I want to thank you for your attention. But we weren't able to do all of our work if it wasn't for the support of numerous agencies. And with that, I want to say thanks, and I'm happy to take any questions.